Everyone has a story. What's yours? Hi, I'm Michael.
And I'm Katie.
And this is Monumental, a small show about the big things God does in the lives of ordinary people.
For the next 8 weeks, we'll be sitting down with a different woman each episode to talk about a turning point in their lives.
A place where God did something big, something they'll want to tell their kids and their grandkids.
Something, well, monumental.
This week, Katie, we're talking to you. What do we need to know before we get started?
I don't think much. I had a pretty normal life until the story you're about to hear. I was a pastor's kid and the third of 5, and, well, I think the rest is in the story.
Let's dig in then.
When I was 14, I started having back pain. Ended up being diagnosed with scoliosis, so my spine was curved like a C shape and twisted, deforming my rib cage a little bit. And then just as I grew throughout high school, the curve got worse and the pain got worse. And by the time of my senior year, my doctor told me I probably just needed to have corrective surgery to straighten my spine because I'd done lots of physical therapy and swimming and exercises, and my muscles weren't strong enough to hold me up anymore.
Okay, so all the way from 14 to 18,
yep.
The idea was maybe you could halt the bad progress.
Thought I could
it some way.
Right, thought I could do exercises to strengthen my muscles to hold me up, and maybe. I mean, you don't know if the curve is going to get worse. They always say it could get worse, but we just watched it, and it did get worse. But it really ended up being a matter of I just didn't have the muscle strength to hold myself up. So by the end of the day, I was leaning over to my left side and just like completely worn out and in a lot of pain. And so we decided it was the best thing to have the surgery to straighten my spine. So when I graduated from high school, I had scoliosis corrective surgery, and they decided to do a fairly new procedure that was supposed to be less invasive. So they always did the surgery where they went in through your back, cut your back open, and they could see your spine straight on to put the rods in, screw the rods into your spine to straighten it up.
Okay, wait, just for some context. Was this surgery, how many decades had this surgery been being done?
Oh, they had done this surgery for a long time. I know there was a lady who was probably in her 50s at the time who had it when she was a teenager.
Okay.
So it had been a number of decades, and it used to be that they always put you in a brace after the surgery, and you would be in the hospital for weeks on end. But it had improved where they weren't putting everybody in a brace after the surgery, and you're out of the hospital within a few days, kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
So
it was supposed to be relatively simple.
Well, yeah. I mean, they say it's a year-long recovery.
Okay.
Really painful.
Okay.
I mean, they had said that this is one of the most painful surgeries you can have because anything bone related is extremely painful. So, but they had come up with even a newer way of doing the surgery so that you didn't have to cut through the back muscle, because healing through cut muscle is really hard, really painful and long. And so there was this new surgery where they were able to go in through your rib cage. They drilled holes through my ribs. They put the rods in through my rib cage, and then they took the bone that they had drilled out of my rib cage, and used that to place into my spine to create fusion for the rods and the screws to hold into my spine.
Okay, because it's your own bone, so it's gonna...
Yeah, they take out the disc.
Okay.
So they removed, I think, 8 discs and screwed in 11-inch rods, 2 rods, 16 screws into my spine to straighten it and untwist it. And then so when they remove disc, they take bone from your body, grind it up into a paste, put it where the disc was removed, and that grows into bone over the course of the next year, and that holds the rod and the screws in. I was in surgery for 10 hours, and I was in the recovery room for 19 hours, and it turned out he really struggled to get all of the disc out. This is sort of jumping ahead in the story because we didn't actually find this out for about 3 years, but he wasn't able to remove all of the disc, and in order for fusion to take place in the spine, you have to get all of the disc out. and he wasn't able to get it all out. So my spine didn't fuse.
Did he know? Did he know that he had botched the surgery?
Well, he wouldn't admit if he knew. He said I had fused beautifully. My spine looked great. The surgery went wonderful. And he wouldn't help us figure out why I was in pain either. He said, with rods in your spine, you can't have x-rays you can have x-rays. You can't have MRIs or other testing because the rods would distort the image and stuff. You wouldn't be able to see it. And he looked at the x-rays and said I had fused. Everything was fine. He didn't know I was in pain. Because what happened was after a year and a half, my pain didn't 100% go away. And then it started coming back and getting worse and worse and worse. And so over the course of 3 years from having that first surgery, I was in extreme pain and didn't know why. And he sent me to a pain management doctor and just said, let her help you. And she said, I don't know why you're in pain. You're going to be in pain for the rest of your life. So here's some pain medication, and just prescribed narcotics for me. And I was on high-level narcotic pain medication.
So that was from ages 18 to 21?
19. I was 19 when I had the surgery. And so I guess I would have been 23. Yeah, I was 23 when I had the next. So I went from doctor to doctor to doctor trying to figure out why I was in pain, and nobody knew. Everybody thought I fused. So finally, my mom, who's like a superhero and does, tons of research, and was like, Katie, or when you're in pain, that's the body's way of telling you something's not right. And so we're going to keep looking until we figure out what it is.
Yeah, I mean, imagine, aside from wrestling with the pain itself, which is very real, I imagine you must have been wrestling with fear just constantly of like, you don't know what the problem is.
Yeah.
And am I going to be in excruciating pain for the rest of my life?
Oh man, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I had to process that and think because this went on for a long, long time, many years, I had lots of moments of thinking like, what's the point? Because I had lots of periods where I couldn't work, I couldn't live on my own. I had at some point moved out and was living in an apartment. I ended up moving home because I couldn't clean, I couldn't shop and cook, and I couldn't take care of myself. And I was depressed, and I had quit school and was backing way off on my work hours. I had lots of these moments of like, and doctors telling me this is going to be your life.
Right. You just have to manage it because there's nothing wrong.
Just cover it up with pain medication, which I also knew would kill me eventually because those things are incredibly strong. And I was a tiny person, and there were like lots of times where I literally just felt like so weak, so shaky, and I just thought my body's dying. That's how I felt. I feel like my body's like slowly dying. And that was only after a few years. So I'm thinking, was it going to be like, even a few more years down the road?
Yeah. And of just, embracing a life of needing narcotics constantly is just, that's very scary.
Yeah. And it just pretty much controls your life because they gave me nightmares. You just walk around in this constant, like, sedated, foggy state.
Almost like you're on drugs or something, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
oh
something like that.
That's awful.
So yeah, I had these thoughts of what's God's purpose for my life? What's the point? If I can't do anything? And so then I started thinking, well, what is man's purpose? What is God's purpose for man? And it's, we know that first catechism question, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. And so I thought, well, if God's purpose for my life is to glorify him, then how do I do that? If all I can do is, lay on a couch and just keep living, I can pray. I still have my mind, so I could pray. And the other thing I thought is I can just keep having faith and trust God, even though I don't understand. Because I could, if people look at me and see what I'm going through and see that I trust God and I believe him and I'm not going to be shaken in my faith, then that gives glory to God and it's a testimony to other believers, hopefully. Anyway, so my mom she decided to look up the doctor who invented this surgery that I'd had through the rib cage, and he was out in California. And so she wrote him and he agreed to see me. So I flew out to California with my parents, and within like 10 minutes, he knew that my spine had not fused.
So what you're telling me is you walked around with a broken back for over 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah, and he could see on the x-rays these halos around where the screws were, showing that the screws were loosening out of my spine.
Oh,
yeah, goodness. That explained the pain.
Yeah.
He said, well, we have to redo this surgery. We've got to get that fusion to work. So he said, I'll do the surgery, and we got to go in through your back this time so we can see your spine straight on. And so we flew out to California, and he did the surgery and went through my back. And I mean, my first surgery was incredibly painful, but I mean, the second one just like blew the first one out of the water. Mm-hmm. And I was in so much pain. I literally like thought I was losing my mind. There was one time in particular where I was laying in the hospital bed there, and I like thought I could actually like see this line where on one side, like on the right side was the hospital room, and my family, an elder and his wife from my church had come to be with us. And there they were on the other side of the line, the left side of the room. It was just pitch black. And I laid there and I thought, if I decide to quit fighting this pain, I'm going to go into that blackness. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I'll come back. Mm-hmm. And I was so weak and tired, I wanted to give up fighting. Yeah. It's such a mental and emotional thing to fight pain. I mean, you have to be engaged in it. You don't have a choice because it's there. So here, the elder's wife from my church was sitting next to me, and I just remember she was calling my name and saying, Katie, we can do this. Keep fighting. I'm here for you. You can do this. And I don't know, she just like helped walk me through it. She was like, take a deep breath. And now, okay, slowly let it out. Good job. Take another deep breath and slowly let it out. And we're going to fight through this together. And it was like she came along and she took my hand, and she literally engaged in the fight with me and helped me. Eventually I fell asleep. And then I remember waking up, and the elder from my church was sitting on my left side where I had seen this blackness, and he was reading from Romans 8 that said, what shall separate us from the love of God? Shall trial, or I don't know, it's just really neat. And I think this is why we have to go back and remember, because when we're there, when we're in that valley or wilderness or whatever it is, we may not be recognizing everything God's doing,
Well, and I think too that when we think back on those very, very dark periods in our life, if we think back on it and think, I was there once, I might end up there again,
Yep.
And that's the fear. You think that could happen again. I could be in that much pain. I could be in that much darkness. And instead of thinking, if that ever happens again, I will have the memory and the experience of knowing that God brought me through. Mm-hmm. Instead of thinking about it that way, we end up just thinking, I know that valley exists.
I've been there before. Do it again.
Exactly. Kind of like, what if I end up there again?
And and that was a huge fear for me. I actually had nightmares about being told I was going to have to go through surgery again.
Oh, yeah.
So I came through that second surgery and spent the next many months trying to get off the pain medication and not being able to. I came down on it some, but ended up going back to California and seeing this doctor again. And he did a test that showed that the rods were irritating my spine. And he said I needed to have a third surgery to remove those rods. And the experience, the procedure to determine that was I had to go in, and I laid down on my stomach on this table, and it was an injection procedure. They were going to do 4 injections on either side of my back, either side of my spine. It was to somehow determine if the rods were irritating the spine. And so they sedate you enough that you can't jump off the table, kind of thing. Goodness. But not enough that you fall asleep, because they want you awake to tell you when they've hit the painful spots. And so it was, it felt like being tortured. And I came out of that. And then, so he finished, and then he said, okay, well, it was successful in telling us what we needed to know, that these rods are irritating your spine and you're going to need to have a surgery to get them removed. And I just remember sitting in the wheelchair, waiting for whatever to get out of there, and just like tears just streaming down my face and just feeling so completely traumatized. And I went back to the hotel room with my mom and my good friend who had come to be with us too. And I just laid on the hotel bed and just cried for 3 hours straight. And I called my dad, and he said, it's not wrong to be afraid. And he told me the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and talked about how afraid Jesus was of the crucifixion and all that was coming. for him and how he was so afraid he was sweating drops of blood. But he said, but you know what? If this is what God has called you to, he will give you the grace to go through it again. And talked about Jesus's prayer, not my will, but your will be done.
Did you ever just struggle with anger when people told you God will give you the grace? And
I think it was really a grace of God that I was so hungry for people to tell me the truth. I was so hungry for people to remind me of God's promises and that God was my strength. The time I remember most clearly of being angry at something someone said to me is when somebody was angry at God for me.
Oh.
And this person was like, I don't know why God is taking you through all of this. You are too young to be suffering this much. And I could tell they were angry at God.
Yep.
And I walked away from that so discouraged.
Yeah.
And so offended.
Yeah.
That somebody...
For God's holiness.
Yeah. And that somebody that they weren't gonna... It was gonna happen.
Right.
I was gonna go through a third surgery. The reality was before me, because it's not like I didn't struggle.
Right.
I mean, there
with
was
questioning God's goodness.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is another thing. Like, over the years of this struggle, there were times certainly where I was really close to the Lord, because sometimes God really does that suffering where he just draws
he binds us
so
to
near.
himself.
But there were other times where I just felt so far away from God. I mean, to a point where I really started questioning if God even exists. So first it started where I just don't feel close to God. I'm praying, I'm reading the Bible, I'm doing the right things, but I don't feel like he's there. Then it started to become like, well, maybe God's forgotten about me, like he put me in this pain and I'm just lying here in bed every day and he's got the rest of the world he's busy with, he's just forgotten about me. And then it started to turn into, well, maybe he doesn't even exist. I was ashamed of those thoughts. Yeah. So I did finally break down and went and told my dad what I was struggling with. And he said, we are emotional people. And if our faith was based on our emotions, how rocky would that be? Because our emotions are up and down and here and there. But he said, the promises of God are, I will never leave you or forsake you. Our faith is to be grounded on who God is and on his promises. And so you need to claim the promise God has given you, that he will never leave you or forsake you, even when you don't feel like he's there. So start praying God's promises.
Yeah.
And so that's what I started doing. I would lie in my bed and I would say, okay, Lord, I don't feel like you're there, but I know you are. Please help me. Please be with me and give me your strength. Okay, so I had the third surgery. I had that one in Indianapolis. He found me a doctor in Indy, so I didn't have to travel all the way to California that time. And thankfully, that one wasn't as painful. They went in through my back again. They removed 2 of the 4 rods that I had in my back. Oh, and the fusion worked from the second surgery, by the way.
Okay.
So my spine was in good shape that way. It really became about, I recovered from that surgery, but then the biggest struggle after the third surgery was coming off of the pain medication, because I'd been on this narcotic pain medication for like 5 years now. The stuff is like incredibly addictive. My body had built a dependency on it. And so I would wean off, a teeny tiny little bit at a time. And it would put me flat on my back for 2 solid days of maybe 3 of literally like on my back, not have the strength to get up. So if I had to go to the bathroom or something, my parents would get on either side of me and lift me off the ground and walk me into the bathroom. And horrifying nightmares, and even just like closing my eyes, I'm not going to sleep, these big crazy images. And I kept thinking, I just want to go take more medicine. And again, it's just like, there's no other way I can say it is just God's grace that I did not give in to drug addiction. It's just God's grace. That's it. Because I wanted it, I wanted the drugs. I thought about the drugs. There were different times where if I was out, I was thinking, when I get home, I'm taking another one, even though I'm not supposed to take one yet. And then for whatever reason, I got home, I didn't, It's just, so then there was a night where my mom and I had been out, and I just was so just so much aggravation inside of me, just feeling so frustrated, not at anybody, anger and frustration and knots in my stomach. And I used to do this thing where I just take my fist and I would just pound on my stomach because I had these knots in my stomach, which was just with drug withdrawal that I was going through.
Yeah.
Depression and irritability. And so when we got home, I went in my bedroom and I closed the door and I turned out the light and I laid on the floor and I grabbed onto my hair and I just pulled on my hair from the roots. I thought, I want to pray, but I do not know what to pray right now. I just do not know how to pray. And I wanted to cry, but no tears would come to my eyes. I was just so aggravated. And so then I thought of the Romans 8 passage that talks about God interceding for us and praying on our behalf when we don't have the words to pray, and how he groans for us. And I thought of that. And so then I just said, Lord, I don't know how to pray right now. Would you please just pray for me? Then that verse again, I will never leave you or forsake you, just started going over in my mind over and over and over again. And then it was the weirdest thing. It was like all of a sudden the room was just filled with the presence of God. And I mean, no words were spoken, no tears were shed, just this like consuming peace and joy. And I just felt like God was right there next to me. I mean, it is the most amazing thing I've ever experienced in my life. And just kind of blows my mind to think that in the moment of one of the moments of most greatest, deepest suffering, God met me with the greatest joy and the greatest peace I've ever known. That's the kind of thing that makes you look forward to heaven. And eventually I did wean off all the medication. But I struggled with depression, and I struggled with fear of the future. I did not want to go on. I was scared to live life. I couldn't imagine life without pain. There wasn't a single part of life I could imagine without thinking about pain or processing how to manage pain. And so the idea of getting a job or going to school or getting married or any of those things just terrified me. And I wanted to die. I wanted to just be done with it. First, I considered taking my own life. And I sat on the edge of my bed and I filled my hands full of a pile of pills. And again, God stopped me. I just imagined him saying, "Why didn't you believe me? I promised I would give you the strength, and I promised I would be with you. Why didn't you believe me?" And so I just poured all the pills back into the bottle, and I just called out to God, and I prayed, "Lord, I don't have the strength. Just give me your strength, because you promised that you will."
Yeah.
And he did. And so then I did start praying that God would take me home and let me die. But then that didn't happen. And so then I changed my prayer again, and I started praying, "Okay, Lord, if I have to live, would you give me not only the ability to live, but would you give me the desire for it?" It's really cool to see now how God answered that prayer but it was cool because then I started going to school, got involved in ministry at my church. And one of the ministries was our church had a ministry in the jail where we went in and we did Bible studies with the inmates every Sunday. And I had kind of been interested in doing that for a long time, but was sort of afraid to. And then I just decided it was time. And I went in there and I shared my testimony with these girls. And it was like when I told them about being on pain medication and God giving me the strength to get off the stuff, these girls are sitting in jail and they're going, "Oh yeah, fentanyl, we've been fentanyl and hydrocodone and Oxycontin and like all this stuff." They knew all this stuff. And then to hear that God had given me the strength and the power to get off of it and to not become a drug addict.
Yeah.
I don't know, we'd be talking about certain things and they're kind of like, la la la. And then I share my testimony and share what God had done with that. And it was like it hit home for them.
Yeah.
I loved the jail ministry and I loved those girls. Anyway, so I did that and I went to college and then I ended up meeting my now husband and getting married. And it's like God just gave me back a life and a joy for it. So, to go into the jail ministry later and I'm sitting in there with these girls and I'm thinking, if it were not for God's grace, I would be right here with these girls. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of them, they were in there because of the drugs that I was on.
Yep.
a few years after I recovered, I wrote a letter of thanks to my doctors, my physical therapists, the pharmacists. They had been with us for so many years. And I just wanted to let them know how it turned out. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote them a letter of thanks. And it was interesting because my mom went in there like the day after they received my letter. And this pharmacist that we had gotten to know over the years, she said, yesterday we were all so discouraged. We were just having a hard day. And we see people become addicted to these drugs all the time. Mm-hmm. And then we got Katie's letter. Mm. And we just stood around and cried because we used to stand in here and talk about how these drugs, how we didn't think she was going to make it. Mm-hmm. What happened down the road, my dad was diagnosed with melanoma cancer. These old fears popped up of this would be too hard. I don't have the faith for this. Yeah. That seemed like the worst thing that could possibly happen, my dad dying. And I mean, here it just shows you like the lack of faith, God had proven himself how many years, and then something else hard pops up, comes up, and I'm like questioning whether or not God will give me the faith, the strength for it. Mm-hmm. But I struggled with that. And then after 9 months of my dad battling cancer, he died. And I stood next to him in the hospital room before he died that day. And I just put my hand on his arm, and Dad and I had walked, me and my mom and dad all together had walked through so many years of suffering together. And my dad was like this rock of faith. He was always telling me, we don't have to understand. We just have to trust God. God knows. We don't have to know, but God knows. And so we will keep having faith and we will trust him. And he always pointed me back to Jesus. He always pointed me to Christ. And I stood there next to him, and I just thought about all the years of suffering God had put us through together. And so I just thanked him. I just thanked him for teaching me how to suffer. And then I told him he was going to get to go be with Jesus soon. And I couldn't wait to meet him there, and that I loved him. And then I walked away from him, which was the most painful of all of the things, all of the suffering I've ever been through. Walking away from my dad was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I just stood there and before I stepped out of that hospital room, and cried and called out to God, pleaded more with God than I've ever. Lord, give me the strength to do this. And my probably favorite verse of the whole Bible, Isaiah 41:10, I think. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And that was God's promise to me. I knew God would give us the strength to move forward without Dad. And I love God so much more for the suffering he's allowed me to go through. Monumental is hosted by Katie Walker and Michael Crum. It is produced and edited by Nathan Alberson with help from Ben Salser. And it is executive produced by Nathan Alberson and Jake Menzel. If you like the show, please don't forget to rate and review. And if you're interested in more great content, including articles written by me and Michael, and even some of our guests, please visit warhornmedia.com.